Thanks, Mary and Chris. I really appreciate it. And it's good to see everyone, those of you that have your cameras on. And I am going to try to utilize the chat today. So if you can use that, depending on what device you're on, that will be great. If it's troublesome for you, don't worry about it. It's just something to try to keep people engaged, because if you know anything about extension, you know we are people, and we love to be face to face with people. But through these challenging times, this seems to be our best avenue to reach those. So today, I am here to talk about specifically drying and freezing, especially with those nice gardens that we have planned and all those nice fruits and vegetables that will be coming in. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. So we're going to try the chat just for a second. So if you're excited today and have ever tried freezing and drying in the past, would you put a 1 in the chat? So if you would just go to your chat and put a 1 in if you've ever tried freezing and drying vegetables and fruits. Awesome. Good job. I see a bunch of 1s coming up. So you all must be pros at this. I may be giving you some info you already know, but hopefully you can learn at least one new item, a topic today. Good deal. Thank you all for utilizing the chat. It's just a way, like I said, to keep everyone engaged. So with that being said, okay, not a pro. Okay, well, hopefully I can help you with some of that today, and then and hopefully answer questions as well at the end. Well, I'm going to start a PowerPoint. So what you're going to see on the screen is a PowerPoint. I will mention there's a lot of information on that, so I will hit each topic, but if you've got questions, just jot those down, and like Chris mentioned, I believe they are going to be monitoring that for me to help answer those questions at the very end. But I thought the PowerPoint would help you take notes if you would like, because sometimes it's hard just listening to someone on the screen. So here we go. Hopefully this will work. All right, do I need to swap screens? Are y'all seeing it okay?
We're seeing it, Michelle. You are,
how's that?
Or you can see the next, there you go. That's perfect.
Okay. Sometimes I can't tell with dual screens on my computer. So anyway, we'll get to that now. So hopefully everyone can see the presentation. So it's going to flow. We're going to do the drying fruits and veggies first, and then we will move on to freezing. So again, if you do have questions, let me know. So moving right on to that. So several of you all have tried drying and things in the past, and the main reason that you want to dry foods is obviously to remove the moisture and the water content that's in the food. And the reason you do that is because of the enzymes that are present, and they promote microorganisms growth if we don't remove them. And so drying is just another easy way to preserve those foods so that we can enjoy them throughout the entire year. So when you think about harvesting and getting those fruits and veggies ready, no matter what it is that you want to freeze, you want to think about the process behind the drying, because there are a lot of specifics to this that if you've never tried it before, I really encourage you to get the So Easy to Preserve book that will help you through this, because there's a lot of things like conditioning that I think a lot of people probably don't do to their dried products. But that's okay. It just helps to know what you're doing to prevent any spoilage and growth of microorganisms, because that's the main idea behind food preservation, whether you use canning, drying, freezing, whatever that may be. It's to help those microorganisms not grow, and so that you can have a good and safe product. So when you think about successful drying, you want to think about heat, the temperature, the air, whether that's in your home or outside, and then air circulation. And we're going to talk about things like oven drying and where that air circulation really comes into play. And with Tennessee, unfortunately, we have a lot of humidity here in Tennessee. So sometimes it's very difficult to dry outside because of the humidity. All these things have to be controlled in order to you to be successful in drying. So if you've ever think about it, those of you that have tried it, if you dry too fast, what happens is it's called case hardening. And I've had this happen to me even in the past. I'll tell you, it just sometimes it's the way it is. But what case hardening is the product, whatever it is that you were drying, has a hard shell form on the surface. And so the surface feels really hard and it looks like it's dry, but it actually traps moisture in the center of the food, and that allows spoilage, and that's what we want to prevent. So when you dry too fast, you can have that case hardenings, and if you dry too slow, microbes can actually grow during the drying process. So it is definitely another science. When we always talk about food preservation being a science, it truly is. There's a lot of chemical reactions that happen and go on, and so when you think about these things, just like those two little things I mentioned about drying too fast and drying too slow, that we have to keep in the back of our minds so that we produce a safe and healthy product. So when we think about drying, why do you want to dry your fruits and veggies? You know, is there advantage to drying versus freezing versus maybe canning if you enjoy doing those? Well, when you think about this, drying is simple. If you've got the items in your household, sometimes there is an expense if you're buying or purchasing a dehydrator, but foods also take up less storage space when you're going to use drying as an option. And really, they're easy to transport. So if any of you all travel, you can use those dried products with you along the road as well and not worry about spoiling. Shelf life can be longer as well, depending on where you store the dried vegetables or the dried fruits. Sometimes you can also freeze those dried veggies and fruits so that they can last longer. But we'll talk about storage a little later in the presentation. So basically, you've got some advantages, like I mentioned, fewer equipment, less storage space. It is simple if you've got the time to do it. So thinking about advantages also comes disadvantages. So some disadvantages of drying, just to mention, so we don't want to talk a lot about the disadvantages because we want to encourage people to try these options, but is that whatever you are going to dry, whatever food product is, you have to continually check it throughout the process. So the food has to be continually watched. Sometimes it has to be stirred depending on what you're using to dry. Sometimes trays have to be shifted if you're using a dehydrator because the air will move and flow differently through the dehydrators, sometimes the bottom to the top, depending on the type. And if you are using those, you have to turn them around every 30 minutes or so, depending on the fruit or the veggie. And there can be no disruption. So you can't start the drying process and think you need to run to the store and say unplug the dehydrator and let it sit and then come back and plug that back in. You cannot have a disruption. So that is also something to think about before you start the drying process, whatever that may be. I don't think the disadvantages outweigh any advantages. I really enjoy food preservation many different ways, but we always want to talk about the disadvantages just so everyone has an idea of what they're in for if you've never tried drying before. Now, there are some unsuitable foods, so you have to also keep those in mind. And I don't have the chat up, so maybe Chris or Mary could help me. So has anybody tried drying a fruit or vegetable before and it turned out horrible? If you did, put a 5 in the box for me. So in chat, if you tried something and it just turned out mushy or it never did dry or it was hard as a rock and you could have knocked a family member out with that, would you put a 5 in the chat for me? Are we getting any answers on that? I guess I could pull that up and see.
Not yet, Michelle. You may want to repeat what you're asking.
Okay, so has anyone tried drying a fruit or a vegetable that did not turn out well? So anybody tried drying maybe an avocado? I love avocados, but anybody tried drying one of those? Or maybe, I don't know, a citrus fruit. Let's see. Nope, not very successful. Okay. Jerky. Oh, that's one of my family's favorites, let me tell you. We could dry pounds and pounds of jerky. They love to eat that. Okay. Just wanted to see where y'all are at. We've been talking for a few minutes, so I wanted to get a question in there for you. I've done easy stuff. Absolutely. I like easy stuff too, that's for sure. Well, with the drying, I wanted to talk about some things that obviously are not good for drying, just so you have an idea. Milk, products, eggs, anything like that obviously you cannot use in a dehydrator or in an oven to dry. And the main reason for that is the foodborne illnesses. They are too susceptible to that, and we cannot have a controlled environment. So we definitely don't want to poison anybody or poison ourselves. So we want to stay free and clear from any type of egg, milk product for drying, because you're not going to have a good product at the end. Some fruits actually are not suitable as well. And I mentioned avocados just a few minutes ago, mainly because we love those in my family, in my household. But mainly you cannot dry them because they have too much fat. It's a good fat. So if you consume avocados, that's fine. But they are not susceptible to drying. It's just not a good product at the end. Some of the others that you see listed on here, I'm not going to go line by line. You can use them for fruit leathers. If anyone's ever tried those, you know, if you've got kiddos or grandkids, they love the fruit like roll-up type things. So you can use those for fruit leathers, but they are not good for drying. Citrus fruits, obviously, they're just too juicy. You cannot get all the moisture and the water content out of citrus fruits, so they're not a good option. Some of the others that you see listed there, the crab apples, too tart, the guavas have too many seeds, pomegranates too, things like that. They have too many seeds in them. So it's just not a good quality product. So it's not a good sense of your time to dry these types of products. Now, moving on then to veggies. Sorry about that. For some reason, my PowerPoint didn't go on. There
Michelle,
are actually
real quick while you're on that topic, Michelle,
yeah.
Question, can you dry citrus peel?
Citrus peel. Well, I have never tried that, I will say, but I would have to look that up. And I don't know if Mary has her book with her. I would assume that you could. It would be like maybe an herb. That's what I would think. I would need to look that up to tell you for sure. But to me, a citrus peel, like I use a lot of citrus in my barbecue sauces and things, dried citrus. So that would be something that would go along those same lines, but we'll check that out at the end. Whoever asked that, we'll get back to them on that, unless Mary may find that before we're done. So thank you for asking that. Unsuitable vegetables that you see listed here, again, I'm not going to go line by line, but basically veggies have a lot of water content in them. And the ones that you see listed particularly are high content water, and they have a lot of surface area. And like broccoli, for example, there's so many crooks and crevices and the little stems that it's very, very difficult to get all of the water and the moisture out of those types of products. And so it's just not a good quality product at the end. It's just too difficult, and because of the layers and the moisture content. So you really want to steer clear of these types of vegetables as well. They're just hard to do, and they're very unsuitable for drying. You can freeze them, and it's a much better quality at the end. Maybe not so much for any types of lettuces and some greens because they really deteriorate, but some of the others you're able to freeze, and you have a better quality at the end for that. So. All right, moving on. And Chris, I meant to mention, you may want to help me on time. I'm really not watching the clock. Like I said, there's several slides to this. So if I'm moving too slow, I might need to speed up just a little bit. So as we get close to 12:30, if you would let me know, that would be great. Okay, some drying methods then. Let's look at these. So when you think about sun drying, solar drying, these types are done, as you may have seen years ago, outside. Have you ever seen the old screen doors and people cut up apples and they lay apples on there for the dried apple pies? Love those. That is what the first thing comes to mind when I think about drying and sun drying. It's got to be a hot, dry climate, usually above 85 degrees. So, you know, midsummer here, it's definitely hot enough, but sometimes the humidity plays a big role in that. So if you are going to sun dry or use solar drying, the humidity has to be less than 60%. So definitely need to keep a check on the weather if you're going to use some type of outside drying method for your fruit or veggie. The other problem with the sun and solar drying is the pollen, unfortunately, around here in our particular area, and pollution sometimes comes into play. So if you do like the idea behind that, there are some other ways to protect your foods and some solar boxes you could actually build if you've got some extra time for that. Not to say there's anything wrong with that. You just have to be mindful of what you're putting outside and then the weather and pollution and pollen count for that day. So sometimes it takes a little longer as well in the sun or solar, just particularly because we're using the sun as the heat source, and it fluctuates sometimes. So it ends up being a longer drying period, which if you've got the time and you like that taste and flavor of the outside, there's nothing wrong with that. But you do need to be mindful and keep that in mind as you're going to plan for that. Now, when you think about drying on the vine, I don't know where you all live, but we live next to fields that have soybeans grown in them. So we always go over there and shake the little pods and see if the beans rattle inside. So you can actually dry on the vine. And some of you may have tried that before. And if you have, you just need to make sure that you're testing them and you're able to shake that shell pod. And if you can shake it and hear dry beans inside, then you're ready to shell those, and then you're able to use those from that point on. So drying on the vine is also another method that you might like to try that's very easy. You just have to keep a check on those seed pods, and that can be any type of legumes or beans if you like kidney beans or lima beans, let's see, any navy beans, depending on what your tastes are and what your family likes. Drying on the vine is a good way to use those. And we're going to leave the dehydrator for last. So I want to talk about the oven for a few minutes. And if you don't care, I would like to go back to the chat just a second. Has anyone used an oven to dry their fruits or veggies? If you did, would you put a 2 in the box for me? Have you used your oven? Great, okay. I see 1 has used an oven, a couple, okay. It's something most of us have, great. Several, okay, good deal. So several of you all have used the oven for drying. And so we'll have to maybe talk at the end and see how that went for you if you had any problems. But you can do fruits, veggies, meats. You can dry all those products in the oven. Basically want to steer away from herbs and spices though, because basically the oven's going to cook those products. And it's just not a good idea to do the herbs and spices in the oven. All the other products are fine. Your oven though is around 140 degrees to dry those foods. And what you would do is you would put, say, a cookie tray down and then lay your tray of dried fruit or veggie on top of that and then start the process from there. And we can get into specific ovens later on as well. I just wanted to have an idea because several of you all have used ovens for drying those, and that's great. It does take about 2.5 times longer than a dehydrator just because it's larger. The door is cracked open a little bit where your dehydrator is enclosed. And so you can dry foods faster in the dehydrator than the oven. Now, let's move on then to just the room. You can sometimes, I've never used this, so I'm not going to tell you I have. People have used their vent from the central heat and air to dry their fruit or vegetable when they have had heat on, obviously not the air conditioning. So I'm not going to tell you how that works necessarily because I've not personally done that. But that is an option that some have used for drying fruits and vegetables. And believe it or not, it can be used. But again, it depends on the temperature in your home and the humidity in your home and whether that's successful or not. Okay, sun drying, I just mentioned. Want to show you a few more pictures and then we're going to move on. A picture of the great beans and legumes there. I love black beans, so we use those a lot outside in our garden. A lot of the fruits that I have, you know, I don't particularly do sun drying, but there's nothing wrong with that. Keeping all of those previous things that I mentioned in mind as you're doing those. Here's another picture. It always reminds me of gardening time and this time of the year. You know, we're moving into June, so starting to see those beans on the vine. A lot of people can beans, but there's nothing wrong with leaving them on the vine to dry as well. And I always think that's just a great, cool picture that reminds you of this time. Now, back to the oven drying. There's some things listed there that we talked about that you can use in the oven for drying. Again, what you want to do, oven has to be at 140 degrees. You're going to prop open the oven door so that heat can move and air can move. And then what is really key, and I'd like to hear from maybe some of the people that have used oven drying in the past, is that you use a fan to promote air circulation. And by doing that, it will help with the drying in the oven. So that is a little key note there. If you've not used a small fan to promote the air circulation, that might help you in drying times in the future if you were able to be successful in your oven drying. So dehydrators. I think that's probably the first thing people think of is purchasing a dehydrator. And sometimes they can be very costly depending on the type that you purchase. And you see some here on the PowerPoint, the ones that have the trays, and then you have the bottom one that has all the removable trays in it as well. The thing with the dehydrators is that's a personal preference as what type you would like to use. Some have actual temperature dials that you can use on those, particularly if you're drying jerky. I saw someone mention jerky earlier, and that's a great way to save costs, especially jerky is very expensive to purchase. So if you can dry your own, that's an easy way to be able to have some fun in the kitchen and make your own jerky and be able to enjoy that for a few weeks and things at home. But you do need to turn it, like I mentioned, sometimes move it around, flip it over, and then every 30 minutes take a check on it. Because for me, sometimes that case hardenings happen quicker than I think it is. And so you definitely want to prevent that because it still has too much moisture inside the meat. Excuse me, that way. So we talked about a few acceptable methods of drying. So let's talk about some not so acceptable methods. And the floor registers is one of those, as I mentioned earlier, as we were talking, microwave ovens. And the deal with the microwave ovens is that it cooks the product instead of drying it. And so some people thought in the past they didn't really have an option but to use that method to get heat, and it will not dry any type of product. It will only cook it. So try to stay away from those if you don't have any other means. We'll try to talk it out and come up with another idea for you. Okay, what about pre-treatments? Let's go back to the chat just for a second and see if everybody's still with me. Now, those of you that have dried fruits and veggies in the past, do you pre-treat your fruits and veggies? Would you put a 1 in there if you used a pre-treatment method in the past? Did anyone pre-treat their fruits before drying them? No? Okay. I'm going to answer one question real quick. I see, would convection work for the fan? Yes. If you have a convection oven at home, that's the perfect one to use for drying, especially if you're going to use oven drying and not a dehydrator. It's perfect. So I don't see any action in there about the pre-treatment, and that's okay. But it is a necessary step to stop enzyme growth, and that's why you want to do the pre-treatment, because all with our fruits and veggies, and we talk about this with canning and preservation too, when you pick whatever item it is, whatever fruits or veggies, not so much the meats, but the fruits and veggies have natural occurring enzymes, and they will continue to deteriorate the product if you don't do some type of pre-treatment. And that's why it is so important to be able to do that. And so when you think about pre-treatments of fruits, there's different methods to use. Blanching, I think most of you all have heard about. I'll talk about some syrup blanching in just a second. That may be the one that you've not really done in the past, but the steam blanching is something I think most people are familiar with fruits and veggies. The antioxidants are all of those vitamin C, the ascorbic acids that you can either purchase in the store. Some are tablets. You can use those on your fruits, and that prevents the enzyme growth and browning if you're using apples, pears, things like that. And then there's actually fruit juice drips and honey drips. And I've not tried the honey dips, but I thought that might be something I would try in the future. As I was getting ready for the presentation today, I usually just do a quick vitamin C antioxidants on mine, or I'll do a quick syrup blanch. I really don't use the others, but I thought I may try the honey because I do like flavor of honey. The only thing is, is it does increase the amount of sugar that's in your product. So if you have diabetes or you're watching the amount of sugar that you're consuming, you definitely want to take a look at some of these things before you decide which pre-treatment that you want to use for your fruits. Pre-treatment of veggies, basically the same reason with the enzymes. It will prevent any more deterioration of the veggies as the drying process proceeds, because you want a good product at the end. You're putting a lot of time, investment into this to dry or can or freeze. So you definitely want to make sure that you've got a good product at the end that your family can enjoy. So killing those particular organisms, microbes, anything that could be on that will also help the product at the end. And I'm moving on, Chris. Sorry, it's already 12:30. I just happened to see it popped up on my computer. And so I know we only have about 15 minutes, so we need to get to freezing. Cooling and drying vegetables is also a critical tip in drying, because you have to dip them briefly in the cold water. So when you heat them up and you do your pre-treatment, most of those methods are warm liquids. When you dip them, and then you're going to dip them in cold water. And I don't know that many people do this particular step. And the next critical piece to this is like blanching corn, for example. When you blanch it and you put it in the cold water, you're not leaving it sit in cold water for 10 or 15 minutes. You're only cooling it to the touch. So it is still going to be very warm. So you really have to be sure that you practice this and really get a good idea and a good feel for what temperature of the cooling really means. And then you're going to drain and obviously wipe off any excess water. You don't want extra water on any of your fruits and veggies while they're drying, because obviously that's going to take an extended drying period if you don't get that moisture off. So you don't want to leave them sit in that cool water, only cool to the touch, so where it's not burning your skin. Single layers, I thought this was a great picture to leave in, because this is what your tray should look like. You don't want things layered on top of each other, because they got to be able to get the air circulating around them so that they're able to dry. So thinking about things that you have dried in the past, did your trays look similar to this picture? And if they did, that's great. And if they didn't, how can you adjust so that may help you in the future for your drying times? So using a dehydrator and oven, we mentioned, I'm going to skip on through that. We've talked about that. We're moving now to doneness. So we've already cut up our fruits or veggies or use them as whole. We put them in the dehydrator, the oven, we're drying. And now how do we know if we're done or not? And so for your fruits, here you go. And I know you all can read this, but as you're using the fruits and you're swapping them around and you're mixing them up in the trays, take a piece out, pull it apart, see what it feels like. Is it pliable? Do you see any water coming out on your hands? Is it sticky? That's the other thing. If it's sticky, it's not done. You don't want any wetness coming out while you're trying to dry. So you're going to have to leave it in there just a little bit longer. If you do like berries, they're some of the easiest because you can hear them rattle when they are done. Some of the apples and pears and things like that take a little bit more experience with it, just knowing on whether you feel like it's done or not. And the conditioning of the fruit. So if you're still there with me, let's go back to the chat for a second. If you have conditioned your fruit after drying, put a 7 in the box for me. Who has ever conditioned their fruit? Has anybody that's still listening on there conditioned their fruit after drying? If you have, put a 7 up there. Okay. No? Okay. I think this is another step sometimes people overlook. Thank you for answering, those of you that have put something in the chat. So the conditioning, sorry, I hit a button on my computer. Let me go back just for a second. The conditioning of the fruit, you pulled it off the dryer, you feel like it's done, it's ready to get put into your bags or to plastic storage containers. But what the conditioning is, you fill it into a glass container or plastic container about 2/3 of the way full. And then you're going to put the lid on for 7 to 10 days. And you're going to shake that up just a little bit in between those 7 to 10 days. And that kind of lets the fruit rest. And it gives you the opportunity to look at the container and see if you have a lot of moisture in it. If you do, then a lot of the pieces are not dry enough. So that is a really good idea to do your conditioning after you have put all this time and effort into it, because you don't want to seal up your bag of all those nicely dried fruits and then mold start growing on it or microbes start growing on it because of the moisture that's still in there. So conditioning those 7 to 10 days. I would not throw it out because at that point there's nothing wrong with it, but you would need to either consume it or put it in the refrigerator to be used soon after, because mold will start to grow right after that length of time if it's still out in the heat, like in your home if it's 68, 70 degrees. So it's a lot of time and effort and money. You cannot put them back in and dry again simply because it's already been through that process. And so the product at the end would not be the same as like drying from beginning to end. So I don't know, let's just use dried apples, for example. Maybe you could go ahead and make up some dried apple pies and fried apple pies and give them to neighbors or something like that. Or go ahead and make, I don't know, just a regular apple pie, excuse me, if you would like to use that type of products, because the moisture in that is really something that you can't let sit out. So the conditioning, though, will give you that idea. Now, if everything turns out fine and you don't have any moisture in that, then you're good to go ahead and storage those however you would like to. Yes, I happen to agree with Chris Hicks. I like those apple pies as well. Now, the last thing I want to mention, and then we're moving on, is the pasteurization. If you choose to do sun or solar drying, as kind of nasty as this may seem, it is necessary to prevent enzyme growth and kill any maybe insect eggs or anything that could be on the product. So you can put it in the freezer for a couple days or put it in the oven, as you see there, for 160 degrees for 30 minutes. And then that will take the pasteurization process and you won't have to worry about anything that could be on your product. All right, quickly then, drying for veggies. You want them crisp, you want them brittle or tough. And so kind of similar for fruits, you want to pick it up, take one out, stir them up, you know. The bottom of your dehydrator will tend to dry faster. So you definitely want to keep switching those trays, and that's why it's so important to check every 30 minutes or so, because if you just check on the bottom and pull one off the bottom, it's going to seem maybe ready to go and pull out of the dehydrator or the oven, and whereas if you take one off the top, it may not. So you definitely want to make sure that you keep those rotating, but pull a piece out, try to break it, see how it works. You know, is it tough enough? You know, you think about dried products, you kind of know the idea behind them and how it feels or how it may taste. And so keeping a check on those. Storage containers, you can use anything that you would like to use. The regular canning jars you're welcome to use, any freezer bags, as long as they are food grade containers. You do want to invest in something, especially putting all this time and effort into the drying. So you want to make sure that they have a good seal on them and that you're able to store them properly. So storage tips as well, because I guess I'm talking way too long and we're running out of time. Once they come out of the dehydrator and the oven, they are going to be warm, so you want to cool them. Remember that you're conditioning the fruit for 7 to 10 days. After that, you want to pack them, get them in the containers that we just mentioned, and then if you look at this particular PowerPoint, 40 to 60 degrees. So if I'm thinking about that, I'm not going to be able to store that in my pantry in my house because my house is not 60 degrees. It's warmer than that. And so I'm going to have to go into my basement, have shelves put up wherever I like to store things, and probably that temperature is going to be fine for my basement. But think about, where do you have space in your home to store these items once you've put the effort into drying them? So the last thing I want to mention about safety on this as well. I just talked with Dr. Bernie and saw her on live, yesterday, and she talked about the storage of dried fruits and veggies. And sometimes I think people have the misconception that you can keep it, you know, for a couple years down the road. But basically, you're looking at the 4 months to a year, depending on your products. And someone mentioned beef jerky earlier, because I know we use a lot of that in my home as well. You're looking at 2 weeks or so to beef jerky. So if you think about that, you really only need to make enough where your family could consume that amount, or your friends, if you're going to share that with others, where they could consume that in a couple of weeks, and then make another batch after that, because it being a meat product and looking at a couple of weeks down the road. Okay, Chris, do you want to take a second, since I'm really like got 5 minutes for freezing? Do we want to go through and answer the questions on, or Mary, if you're monitoring the chat, do we want to answer questions with the drying before we move on?
I think we've kind of answered questions as we've gone, Michelle. I think you're good on questions. Mary, you tell me if I've missed something. I think you're good, and don't worry about the time, Michelle. If folks have to drop off, they can. But you take your time and cover what you need to. We're good.
Okay.
The question did come out: at what point do you pasteurize? Maybe before you go into freezing, Michelle.
Okay. Let's see. The pasteurization would occur after. They can say past 1. Okay, you would pasteurize after you have dried them. So once they are out in the sun, because that's where they would be exposed to the particular enzymes that are out there, and the pest, and the possibility of eggs being from the pest that we have living in our environment. So it would be after you dry them. Okay, so sorry about this. There's so much information, you know, canning and preservation and drying and freezing. It is just such a science that there's so much to it, but it can be easily done if you've just got the right methods down at home. So I'm going to move on to freezing, and we'll try to get you done in an hour, because I know it's a long time to sit. So thinking about freezing instead of drying, then there's many foods that you can use that you can freeze. They can be done quickly, right from the garden, and that's basically the best time to do that. You don't want to harvest a bunch of fruits and veggies and then let them sit in your refrigerator or your home for, you know, 5 to 7 days, because the quality of that product starts to deteriorate, just like you would for canning. So you definitely want to freeze when that product is at its best, because then as you're thawing out, you want to have a good product as well, because this all takes time and effort on your part. So you definitely want to be able to harvest those particular fruits and veggies and be able to freeze them right after. Some advantages to freezing is that you don't have to purchase, say, a canner if you don't already have one. You don't have to purchase a dehydrator to dry or anything like that. All you have to have are food grade containers that you want to put these particular fruits or veggies in, and you do have to have some type of blanching method. So you do have to kill the enzymes just like you do for drying. So for the freezing, that's basically all you have to have: the product itself, a method to blanch and kill the enzymes, and then some packaging, and then freezer space. So I don't think people just tend to go with freezing if they don't have some type of freezer space. But we will talk about freezers in just a second, and the use of those chest freezers versus upright freezers. Now, I always get a question: does freezing kill microorganisms? So freezing stops the growth, but it does not sterilize the product. So if there were to be some type of microorganism on the product and you freeze it, it will not grow while it is in the freezer at 0 degrees. However, once it comes back out and it thaws out and you're getting ready to cook it and it's above that 40 degrees, then yes, microorganisms can continue to grow. So does it kill microorganisms? No, it does not. But it does prevent their growth while the product is in the freezer at 0 degrees. So hopefully that answers some of the questions that maybe some of you all have had in the past when you talk about microorganisms and things, because that's why we're preserving these foods, so that they are safe to eat months down the road when we're maybe in November and December and we want a great fresh product from the garden. Now, corn, this definitely makes me think of summertime, but in particularly, there's a lot of enzymes in vegetables. So those particular enzymes have to be stopped before you get to the freezing process, or the product will continue to deteriorate. So that's why you have to blanch and stop that enzyme from growing. Now, in our book, some of you may have that So Easy to Preserve book. Your extension agent has that, so Mary could answer any questions for you if you're in Smith County. And there's a whole laundry list of blanching times for many different fruits and veggies, so it varies. Sometimes it's 3 minutes, sometimes it could be 5 to 7 minutes, depending on the product. But what you're doing is dipping it down in that boiling water for that length of time, and it's very important that you adhere to that particular time that is given in the So Easy to Preserve book. Those recipes are tested at the point where it does kill the enzymes. Excuse me. And then after it's blanched, you're putting it in the water to cool, and then pulling it out and drying it off before you're getting it ready to go into the freezer. A couple of things with the blanching and the reason you need to adhere to the specific time period. It's worse if you blanch not, if you do not blanch long enough, the enzymes will grow faster than if you didn't blanch at all. And so I know some people don't blanch their veggies. They just want to take their chances and go ahead and put them in the freezer. But that is the reason you do blanch. But you need to adhere to the times that we do have listed that we're able to give to you. And you can look at the National Center for Home Food Preservation. It's got all of the same resources as well. And you're able to go there and look up all of the times for whatever fruit or veggie that you're doing. But it is very important on the time for the enzymes for the veggies. Enzymes for fruit, basically the same. It creates a browning. Your peaches, would be better than apples and pears. They tend to brown much quicker, but they all do have a browning. And so the enzymes in the fruits are killed by using the ascorbic acid or vitamin C. There's some ascorbic acid mixtures that you can use that you can purchase in the store as well. So any of those items you're able to use on the particular fruit that you may be getting ready to fruit. Excuse me. Let's talk about meat then very quickly. Has anyone ever put a piece of meat in the freezer and think, oh, this will be so good in, 2 weeks? Well, guess what? Time ran out in 2 weeks and you didn't get a chance to use it. And so now we're a month down the road and you go to pull that piece of meat out and it looks tough and it looks freezer burnt and it looks brown. If that's ever happened to you, it's probably because of the packaging that we have put the meat in and where air has gotten into that package of meat. And that meat can become rancid, and it's the fat that's in the meat and it hits with the air and it just makes for a bad product, off flavoring, the toughness of the meat product, whatever that may be. And so that's some of the things that we want to try to prevent while we are freezing. So we definitely want to use a good freezer packaging, whether that's going to be in bags or whether that's in freezer paper, but it does need to be specific for freezing to prevent the rancidity that you may experience with some meats. Now, high starch veggies are really good for freezing. There's nothing wrong with these. They just mention them, because you do need to, like for corn, for example, blanch those particular veggies to get them ready to go into the freezer bags. Sometimes, obviously, corn, people like cream corn, and they'll cut those off the cob and heat those up and get that ready for the freezer as well. So we just want to mention the high starch veggies just so that you know that those are very suitable and acceptable for freezing. Now, when you're talking about freezing, you do want to freeze as quickly as possible. So after you blanch and dip them in the cold water and you dry them off, pat them dry. And the reason you do that is you do not want extra ice crystals forming on your product as you put it in the freezer. They're going to form anyway a little bit, but every time that you allow extra moisture or water to be on the product, it's going to have larger and larger and larger ice crystals. So one thing you will need to think about is your freezer. So let's go ahead and talk about that right now, like chest freezers versus upright freezers, depending on what type of storage you have. Every time you open that freezer, some of the cold air comes out. So you do need to manage the temperature of your freezer and make sure that it is at least at 0 degrees. If it heats up a little bit, and I'm going to show you this in just a second on a slide, every time it heats up, say maybe even 5 or 10 degrees, then it creates more ice crystals to form on those frozen products that you have, and that deteriorates the product at the end when you do thaw it out for consumption. So that is something you definitely want to freeze quickly and to allow to stay frozen for the length of time that you have it in your freezer. The fluctuating temperatures, like I mentioned, do make a difference. So look at green beans, for example. So I thought this was a perfect way to explain on the freezer. You use all this work, you have your beans frozen, you didn't have time to can, so you throw them in the freezer. If you keep them at 0 degrees and have went through the process properly, a year, they're great. But let's say something happened and your freezer warmed up to 10 degrees and you didn't realize it, then it's good for 3 months then at that point before the deterioration. And then at 20 degrees, I hope you would notice your freezer warming up at this point. But at 20 degrees, then that same green bean product would only stay for 3 weeks, and then at 30 degrees for 5 days. So if you look at that, that's how important it is to keep a thermometer in your freezer and know exactly what your temperature is. Some of you may have newer freezers where you can hit that button and it shows the electronic temperature, but I would still recommend putting a thermometer inside somewhere where you can keep the temperature yourself and look at it occasionally when you go into the freezer. The other key behind that is that you're not opening and closing your freezer time and time and time again. So try to be mindful in packaging in your freezer and how you have things together, maybe your fruits together, your veggies together, your meats together, so that you know exactly where to go in your freezer. Because I'm afraid a lot of people are so busy, they go home, they lift up maybe their chest freezer, they throw the stuff in. So now you got meat, then you have corn, then you have tomatoes, and then you have green beans, and everything is jumbled up in the freezer, and it takes you longer to go through those products to find what you want to have to pull out. So if you can really work at the beginning as you're stacking your freezer, it is much more efficient for you and for your products that you have. The moisture loss in products is what you see here, and what this is poor packaging. As moisture escapes, more ice crystals form and make a tougher product, and that can go for your fruits and veggies as well as any meats that you have. The ice crystals that you see here are smaller, but as the time increases in the freezer, and let's say the freezer is opened and closed more and more, those will increase in size. I'm not gonna lie, I opened my freezer one time and I found this one piece of beef at the bottom that we had packaged, and I opened it up and it looked like a huge ice cube. It was huge. I don't know what I had done, forgot about it, but that told me that it had a lot of moisture loss, and every time I opened my freezer, more and more ice crystals formed. It was huge. You know, so unfortunately I was not able to consume that, but that's a loss of money for me. So you definitely want to try to prevent those things. Here's some containers you can use. Like I said, just make sure they are food grade containers. You don't want to use a container, say you went to the store and you use butter and you use that butter container and you're like, oh, I'll just throw my veggies or my fruits in here to put them back in the freezer. Don't do that. You want to specifically go out and purchase food grade bags or containers to store your fruits and veggies in and meats in if you're going to freeze them. Here are some things that I think most of you all probably know are not acceptable for freezing. Any lettuces, green leafies, those break down and basically turn to mush. Rices, spaghettis, also very soft. Eggs you cannot freeze because they do not have the same product as taking them out. Potatoes, some fried foods, depending because of the oil content, you will not want to freeze as well because the product will not be the same and you probably wouldn't consume it once you thawed that out. And I'm talking about home freezing and home canning and home preservation. If you look manufacturer-wise, they use different methods in their manufacturers that use an ultra-high temperature processing that's very different than what we can make at home. And so they have different processes and are able to store things that we can at home. So if you're thinking about that. And then almost at the end here for the veggies, and then moving on to fruits and we'll be done. Some things here, these are all for seasoning of the products before you put them into the freezer. What we recommend is that you only lightly season whatever it is that you're freezing. The majority of your seasonings are going to be added after you have thawed the product and you're going to use it to make something in the kitchen. At that point, then you can season, add your spices, because things like your garlics, they become bitter after time. So you don't want to add a bunch of garlic to something and then freeze it for 6 months, take it out, because it may have a very off flavor that you would not consume. So you don't want to do those types of things. So use these seasonings after you thaw them out. So I hope y'all are still with me. Finishing up then with fruits. When you're freezing fruits, just like when you're drying, you do have to put them in some type of sugar pack, because you've got to get them ready depending on the product. Excuse me. So you can do a syrup pack, and there's recipes for that. Basically, I think it's about a cup of sugar to 4 cups of water for a light syrup. If you like a heavier syrup for your fruits, we can look those recipes up for you. Mary can help you with that as well in our preservation book. But around that for a light syrup, I don't like to add any extra sugar, because usually I'm going to add that in my baking or whatever I'm using the product after. But that's what the syrup pack. The sugar pack, you would sprinkle sugar onto the fruit itself before you put it into the freezer. The dry pack and the tray packs, you may have tried in the past with maybe blueberries or raspberries, blackberries, things like that. And what that is, you're going to place them on a tray, and then you're going to put them in the freezer, and they're going to dry individually. Because if not, sometimes those products all clump together and they'll stick together. And so when you're doing the dry pack or the tray pack, when you put them in the freezer, they dry individually. And then once you get them out, you can throw them in your baggie, and then you can pull those out one by one. Honestly, I like to just throw a couple grapes in the freezer and freeze them a little bit and eat them as a snack. So you may try that next time if you need a cool snack as the heat starts to warm up just a little bit. And then the unsweetened packs. You can use artificial sweeteners, of what I've seen. I don't personally, but you can use those in the syrup packs to preserve your fruits. So here's just a couple pictures of the fruits packed in the syrup. Here's your sugar, that the sugar is just placed on these particular fruits, and then they're placed in bags. Like strawberries, for example, if you were going to freeze strawberries, you put the sugar in there, and they generate their own liquid. And so usually it's enough that you can then freeze them all together. And with that. And then here's your dry pack. As I mentioned, once you freeze these individually, they're good to throw into your container, and then you can pull them out individually as you want for your products. And then one last mentioning on these particular fruits, and it's the browning. That's what's important with that, is you want to prevent that before you are putting them in the freezer, because if they are already brown by the time you put them in the freezer, the enzymes are already breaking down, basically as soon as air hits it. And so you've got to be ready to put the ascorbic acid on those and prevent that before you're doing the syrup mixtures, and then get them ready to go into the freezer bags. Chris, am I okay, or do I need to stop?
No, you're great.
We only got about 4 minutes.
I don't think Zoom will cut us off.
I don't know. I don't know.
You're good. Everybody's enjoying it.
Okay. Well, just a couple more then. Blanching for the veggies. The water blanching, you all know it's boiling water. The product goes down into the water. The steam blanching is where you have a pot at the bottom. You have, as you see here, a strainer device, but it has a layer on top where the actual product is only, say, 2 or 3 inches down into the pot. And so it's the steam that's actually blanching the product, not the water itself. So nutrient content loss is less with steaming than water blanching, but I don't think it's enough that it would be a concern for you. But that is, if you are concerned about that, the steam blanching would give you less than the water blanching. And then microwave blanching, you are able to use the microwave in blanching those products and getting them ready to kill the enzymes before you put them in the freezer. These are similar to the fruits, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but the dry pack or the tray pack are the different types of packs for your veggies. It's just putting them into the freezer on that tray, make sure they're dry individually and not all thrown into the bag together where they're still wet and where they're all going to stick together. I'm gonna tell on myself in just a minute. I used green pepper a lot in my recipes, and so I had a lot of green peppers. So I just hurry up and cut them up, dry them up, threw them in the bags, and it's like a big blob. And so I had to keep thawing those out because they're not. That was a waste of my time and product, just to be honest. So I hate to even tell that, but I was just in a hurry. I need to hurry up and get it done, and I just threw them in. So it's definitely, if you've got the time to do it, it is well worth your time to do it correctly than to do things in a hurry, because at the end, when you want to use it, the product is not as good. So for the freezing, though, again, for the veggies, it is the same. Basically, the freezing individually, get them in their food grade containers, the bags, the jars, whatever it may be, and then placing them in the freezer so that you are organized and know where those products are so that you're able to get them out. And then that is it. So let me stop screen share here. Well, if my mouse would work correctly. So I apologize. That was a long time. I, as myself, don't like to sit for an hour. There's just so much information for drying and freezing.